The New York Times have a newsletter called The Ethicist, where the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah responds to questions from their subscribers that are based around ethics or philosophy and gives them his opinion as a philosopher. Now, recently an edition of this newsletter came out that was based around antinatalism, and I wanted to give my thoughts on it. So let's dive into the subscriber's question and Kwame's response. The world is falling apart. Should I scrap my plans to have kids? So the full question from the subscriber goes as follows. I have a question about planning for the future in light of the recent presidential election and the prospect of potentially having a dictatorship in America. Very quickly before I go on, if you want to hear my thoughts on the recent election of Donald Trump, which is what they're referring to, and what it might mean for antinatalism, check out this video. I've put it in the description. I'm a 33-year-old woman. For a long time, I've wanted to start a family. I'm about to start investing substantial money into family planning. In view of climate change, overpopulation, and now the result of the election, I've started to wonder if maybe it's just not meant to be. There are so many wars going on, and with America turning isolationist, I fear for the world. It feels like everything is falling apart. There's so much uncertainty, and it doesn't feel safe anymore. Knowing everything we know about the strain that will be placed on our democracy, a gutting of climate change protections and climate change policy, and threats to women's rights, is it right to be wanting/planning to start a family? Or should I plan to adopt instead? Am I being overly cautious, or is it valid to reconsider? So before we get on to Kwame's response, I want to give a few thoughts of my own. So obviously this woman is being much more considered than I think the average person is. She's focusing on recent events, which I think is unduly limited. There are fundamental things about the way that our life is, and I've made a video on this, so I'll link that in the description, that really compel us to reconsider the ethics of whether it's okay to bring someone into the world. But she's focusing on more modern things like an election, climate change, wars going on at the moment, which are valid things to take into account, but to limit your considerations to those I think is undue. And these aren't small things we've got to remember. We don't know what the future may hold with the uptick in wars that have gone on at the moment, the impending results of climate change. And of course, there are more things that she hasn't even mentioned, like the revolution in artificial intelligence at the moment. We have no idea if this is going to go well or badly. If it does go badly, it could go very badly. These are all quite extreme uncertainties that are really no stable foundation for a positive ethical evaluation of creating a child into the world that we live in. Even if we ignore the more fundamental things that I think are captured in philosophical pessimism, as I put forward in the video I've linked. She is also aware that adoption is a choice. She mentions it in her question. So personally, I don't think she's being overly cautious. I think these are valid things to take into account. And when you know that not creating someone is not doing something wrong, they don't exist to be harmed in any way or deprived, and you know that you can satiate your want to raise someone with adoption, she seems to be relatively all sorted, at least on the macro level. So let's see what Kwame has to say. 100 years ago, you would have been bringing a child into a country where perhaps a majority of people lived around or below the poverty line, where, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1926, we continually have mobs fighting and doing unutterable things because at bottom, men are afraid of being unable to earn a respectable living, where stepping on a track could prove fatal, where environmental regulation, as we understand it, hardly existed, where segregation was widely entrenched and reproductive rights were scarcely to be found. In the meantime, Stalin was consolidating his power in the USSR, Mussolini was eliminating forces of opposition in Italy, and Hitler was rebuilding the Nazi Party in Germany. Still, people had kids, and so here you are, able to look back in horror at the way things used to be. You cannot, of course, guarantee that any child of yours will have a brilliant, successful life. For all the challenges we face, however, I'm not convinced that raising a happy and flourishing child in this country is bound to be so hard that it will be unfair to bring a new person into the world here. Many people will disagree with you about what the next 4 or 40 or indeed 400 years are likely to hold. If you remain confident in your predictions, you could certainly join the estimated 1 to 2 million families waiting to adopt, a large multiple in any case of the number of children available for adoption. As the saying goes, the future hasn't been written yet. The question is how you feel about your progeny playing any role in writing it. If having a child is always a form of hope, not having one because you're sure what lies ahead can, I fear, be a form of hubris. So let's go through this point by point. So Kwame starts out by laying out a very bleak view and an accurate view of a period in time in the past and says, essentially, back then was so bad and people still procreated, so perhaps you are being a bit overcautious. Now, there are a few things to say on this. The first thing is to say that's assuming those people were right to procreate. Just because someone has done something in a much worse situation than us doesn't mean that we're okay to do it in the current situation we're in. Perhaps those people were wrong to procreate and that we would actually be right in not procreating now. The picture that Kwame paints in the past is a world that it seems highly unethical to bring a child into. Just because people did choose to do it doesn't mean they were justified in choosing to do it. After all, any of these conditions that we bring a new person into, like segregation or a lack of environmental regulation, or any of the things that Kwame lays out, would be seen as highly unethical if we did it in the context of someone who already existed. If we took someone who already existed and didn't suffer the burden of segregation and then put them completely unnecessarily into a situation where they face segregation, we'd see this as highly unethical. And yet we do this when we create someone. Of course, we don't take someone who already exists and put them into segregation, but we create someone who didn't need to exist on any level. There are no ghost fetuses out there wanting to come into existence. We created someone who didn't exist, could not be harmed in any way, was not deprived by their non-existence, and we created them into segregation to suffer the burden of that. Now, of course, someone may say, well, segregation is bad, but, life with segregation is better than no life at all. And presumably they would say this because even living in segregation or even something like slavery can have its positives. We can still have family bonds, we can still have friends, we can still enjoy some parts of our lives. But the thing is that before we create someone, there is no one to want these things. We are creating someone for positives that they don't exist to want, and the cost at which these come is the negatives of segregation and other things that Kwame listed, and other things that he didn't even list. This standard seems ridiculous, to say that these people procreated in a situation which seems highly unethical, and therefore you're okay to do it and you're being overly cautious if these smaller things, or perhaps smaller things, are what you have to consider in the modern day. Kwame then goes on to recognize that we can't guarantee children good lives, but that he's not convinced that bringing someone into this world is so harsh, or raising them is so hard, that it would be unfair to create them. So let's look at that first part. There's a recognition that we can create someone who would have a bad life, and perhaps even a life with extreme suffering. Given the fact that if we don't create this person, no harm is coming from that, why would we run the risk for absolutely no reason? We're gambling with the welfare of a new person for absolutely no reason. Why would we run the risk on their behalf? Who are we to take the risk on their behalf? Again, if we were to take a risk as consequential as this one with an existing person, it would be seen as highly unethical. Even if the potential upsides were massive, given the potential downsides and their magnitude, it would be seen as highly unethical to do that with an existing person. Why do we feel entitled to do it with someone who doesn't exist at this present time? And to quickly address the second part, of course it would be unfair to create someone into this world. Once we are here, of course we can enjoy it and want to continue our lives. But like I said before, the only reason that people are in the situation where they want these things or even need these things is because we created them in the first place. There was no need or want to come into existence. And remember, all of this comes at the cost of the negatives in life: cancer, dementia, disability, climate change, exploitation, discrimination, loneliness, chronic illness, chronic pain, bereavement, torture, accident. All of these things are the cost that are guaranteed or potential, and obviously there's the guarantee of death as well, that another person has to pay for the choice that we made on their behalf. This doesn't sound like fairness. Kwame then goes on to talk about our future being unwritten, and that the question is how we feel about how the people we could create playing a part in writing it, which seems like an extremely selfish framing to this whole question. I would understand if Kwame was under some, as I see it, delusion that bringing someone into the world is to their benefit, but to frame this as our futures, the potential procreators' futures, and center us in the narrative of creating a child, that the child is a tool of writing our futures, seems extraordinarily selfish and misguided in the framing of how we should view an ethical situation like this. And then he rounds off by saying, if having a child is always a form of hope, not having one because you're sure what lies ahead can, I fear, be a form of hubris. Now, hubris is having an extreme level of like pride or confidence in oneself, essentially being grossly overconfident. Now, the idea that not having a child because you're uncertain about whether their future is actually going to be worth bringing them into existence, to call that hubris seems wild to me. Let's break down the two options here and see which one has more hubris. One option is creating a child, the other is not. Now, in both cases, we don't know what the future may hold. It may go well, it may go badly. So there's uncertainty there. We also need to be uncertain about our capacity to provide that child with a good life. Even if the future does go well in general in the world, we have no idea of the life that the child we create will lead in that world. So we have to be sure we're up to the job of giving that child the best shot possible. We also have to be confident enough in ourselves that we've made the correct ethical evaluation, because if we create them and we're wrong, there's a victim there. But what about not creating someone? Well, not creating someone I view as more modest. We recognize the uncertainty in ourselves, in the future, in the world around us, but also in our ethical evaluations. If we create someone, like I said, and we're wrong, we've done something extremely bad to someone else. But if an antinatalist, for example, or like this woman sending in the question, doesn't create someone because of her considerations, and she was wrong, or we are wrong, then there's no harm done. The person doesn't exist. They can't be harmed. How is this hubris? So overall, I think this woman was mulling over reasonable considerations when approaching the question of whether to create someone or not. I feel like the advice that was given was severely lacking in quality and careful consideration. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.